Hello everyone and welcome back to part 3 of Dante. In this video I'll cover the basing of the miniature, which mostly comprises of this huge Tyranid head. Indeed, it was a major part of the miniature and great fun to paint on its own, but also with the release of 10th edition around the corner, and a major release for Tyranids, this might give you some ideas on how to paint the main Leviathan scheme. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Starting off here, I've already base coated the head itself by brush using Ushabti bone. I then went on to block out the carapace with a mix of Screamer pink and black. Now I should also point out here that I'm using a slight variation of the recipe on the Evi archive. This is now the older Leviathan recipe and it doesn't seem entirely accurate to the 10th edition scheme anymore. And I'm not too sure exactly what that one is, but if I was to hazard a guess, I think they still use something like this, Screamer pink and black, and then add a light bone colour, something like Screaming Skull to highlight, instead of the usual Fenrisian stage. I think both methods look great though, and this old method still works really well. It's also worth mentioning that as this is a display piece, I'm going to be adding a few more stages than if I was going to be doing this for a studio paint job. And that's really because I want the end result to be as smooth as I can make it. Beware that you might need to simplify this a bit if you're using it for an army project. So instead of going straight to Screamer pink for the shading on the flesh, I instead made a mix of Ushabti bone and Screamer pink, applying this as a wash into the recesses. Washing it like this might cause a few tide marks to appear, but I'm not too worried at this stage, as I'll go back in and tidy up with the base coat later. You can also add a touch of medium into this to help get a smoother application. I'm also using a size 3 Rosemary & Co. Series 33 brush here, but any large brush should work quite well. Rosemary & Co. particularly makes some great and inexpensive brushes, at least compared to Winsor & Newton, and have become my go-to for base coating, blending and glazing, whilst I still buy the occasional Winsor & Newton for edge highlighting. And I do also have an affiliate code for Rosemary & Co, which I'll put into the description below if you wish to purchase these brushes. And it's only a small 5% kickback that I get, but every few months it allows me to buy some new brushes, so a massive thank you to everyone who's used that link so far, and I really hope you're enjoying using those new brushes. Next I'm going to increase the shading by using pure Screamer pink, and I'm applying this in a much more controlled way into the recesses of the flesh. I'm aiming for a slightly more opaque coverage here, so I thinned it down a bit less than the previous stage. And this also helped to cover all those patchy bits in the recesses where the wash had pooled slightly. Now I know that I've said this before on videos, but I think it's a really important point to reiterate. If you really want a smooth high-end display level paint job, then this is where to spend the time. Just getting a smooth transition between the shading and the base coat. Going back and forth as many times as you need. Make a 50-50 mix and glaze in between transitions if you need to, or even just use stipple glazing to smooth them out. This is what's going to provide you with a really strong foundation, where the sharp edge highlights are just the cherry on the top. And that's really what I'm doing here. Going back in with a thinner version of the base coat, really starting to smooth out the transitions and bring in the flatter areas back up to an opaque Ushabti bone. And like I said before, don't do this for an army, this is really only for display level painting, and you'll just end up driving yourself crazy, especially for a horde army like Tyranids. However, if you do feel like painting a Tyranid or anything else for Golden Demon, or any other competition, or just display level, then this is where to spend a lot of the time. Now I went in with a very selective deep shade in some of the deeper recesses. The original recipe doesn't call for this, but I felt like it really needed it to improve the contrast and definition of the skin. I didn't want to go too far with it, so just adding a small touch of black into the Screamer was enough. And for this head I mostly concentrated this around the eyes, the jawline and the holes in the flesh. After that was done, it was time to start highlighting the skin. The original recipe calls for Screaming Skull here, but personally I find that mixing AK white into the Ushabti until it's roughly the same value works really well, as I'm going for a very blended finish, and the AK paint feels slightly easier and smoother to work with, but both options will work fine. And I'm applying this paint quite thin and building it up over a few layers, As we're working with organic flesh and not armor, a lot of the shapes are quite soft, and we should treat these shapes accordingly, aiming to create a softer highlight transition. Now I kept adding white into this mix, building up to almost pure white for the finer highlights, and I used these to pick out the features of the face. Now, as you can see, I've already left some of the screamer pink transition towards the bottom of the neck where the wound is. Over the top of this, I started to stipple a thinned down mix of corn red and screamer pink. This is going to create a bruised and gory look around the wound, and stippling this on creates a nice natural texture that looks like fine spots of blood, and I built this up over several layers. I then added a small amount of black into this mix and continued stippling further around the wound. This helps to create a dried blood effect. Now to highlight this, I added Dawnstone Grey into the corn and screamer mix. This will desaturate the edge of the wound, adding to the effect. Then I simply added white into this mix for the further sharp highlight. And finally, I placed a few white dot highlights to help sell the effect. Now back to the carapace. You might remember that I previously base coated this with a 1:1 mix of screamer pink and black. So next I added more pink into this mix, around 2 parts to 1 part black, and then glazed this towards the edges to create a bit of a gradient. To shade this, I took a very thin down black paint and then glazed this into the recesses of the carapace. Now it was time to start adding those typical striations that you tend to see on Tyrannid carapace, and for this I first applied a chunky edge highlight of screamer pink. I should also mention that I find it best to angle the part so that you're painting the lines towards yourself, starting with the thinner end first. Obviously, I can't really do this as easily when I'm trying to film the process, but it is a much more natural and easy way to paint, at least for me, so experiment to find out what's most comfortable for you. For the next sharper highlight stage, I made a 1-to-1 mix of Screamer Pink and Fenrisian Grey. This was then followed by a final highlight of almost pure Fenrisian Grey. If you wanted to adapt this recipe to look a bit more like the 10th edition box art, I would recommend just replacing the Fenrisian with a warm bone colour instead, something like Screaming Skull for example. Finally, I applied a few dot highlights of white on the very corners of the carapace. And to add to the battle-scarred look of the Tyranid, I added some chips and damage with the previous highlight colours, carefully painting in lines of black above the highlight to give them a sense of depth. Now to paint the tongue, I made a mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Screamer Pink, adding increasing amounts of the Cadian into the mix to highlight. I then simply added some AK white into this for the further highlight stages. This took a fair amount of stippling back and forth and fine adjustments to get the highlights smooth and soft, but I eventually built this up to pure white highlights to help sell the wet look of the tongue. It's important to mention that if you do go too far with the highlights and an area starts to look a bit washed out, then you can very easily reintroduce some colour with a very thinned down glaze. The lighter areas will pick up darker saturated glazes much more easily. For example, on this tongue I would use some very thinned down Screamer Pink or Corn Red, pushing it towards the recesses and midtones to add the saturation back in. With the tongue finished, it was time to paint the teeth, and for this I made a very simple recipe, starting off by base coating the teeth with Storm Vermin fur. I then added Ushabti bone into this to highlight. The grey of the Storm Vermin will help to separate the teeth from the surrounding areas of flesh. I then went on to add some AK white into the mix for the final highlights. For the eye, I went for a nice strong yellow, using some Avalon Sunset for the base coat. I then highlighted this very simply by adding some Dawn Yellow into the Avalon, and a tiny bit of shading in the upper corner of the eye by adding some Screamer Pink into the yellow, followed by a dot highlight of white in the corner of the eye. Over the base coat of Screamer Pink and Black, I then layered over the gory details of the neck using Corn Red with just a touch of Cadian Flesh Tone. I added more and more Cadian Flesh Tone into this mix to bring out the details further, eventually adding white into the mix with small spot highlights to make the gore look suitably fresh and glistening. Now for the teeth or horns, and I'm not entirely sure what these are, but I first base coated them using black, and then I started to glaze a very thin down corn red over the top, glazing the red a bit more towards the end of the horns to create a smooth gradient. To highlight this, I then went in with some Mephiston Red to carefully pick out the edges and details. This was then further highlighted with a 2-to-1 mix of Mephiston and Squig Orange, working up to mostly Squig Orange for the sharp highlights. For the final sharp highlights, I made a mix of Ungor flesh and squig orange and applied this to the uppermost raised edges. Finally, I applied some dots of white to make the horns look nice and sharp. The sand was then base coated using Rhinox hide, and this was followed by dry brushing various greys over the top and adding Ushabti bone into the grey. This is the base after adding some Vallejo rusty pigment, and I just worked this into the cracks with a small brush without the need to use any fixative. Pigments are super useful for adding some extra dusty textures and colours into an otherwise boring base, and also for tying the different basing elements together. I then continued to paint the helmet using the same recipe as the Blood Angel video, and I won't be covering that recipe again in this video, but it will be in the top right of the screen now if you do want to check that out. And then the sword was painted very simply by adding black into VMA silver, but I'll cover that in far more depth in the power weapon video which is coming up next, including how to paint the electrical effect. But that's about it for part 3 everyone. Thank you for taking the time to watch this series, and I hope there's been some useful information here. Next I'll be painting another Tyranid that I'm quite excited for, this time inspired by the 3rd edition Codex art. And that will be followed by some of the new Seraphon and Lionel Johnson. So plenty of great videos coming up, and I will catch you next time.